Hello, I'm Rebecca from Darling Leather and Fur. In this tutorial, you will learn how to make a pair of fur gauntlet mittens from start to finish using a fur sewing machine or hand sewing. This video has bookmarked chapters which can be found in the description below and in the mitten tutorial guide that will print out with the pattern. Please encourage anyone interested to purchase the pattern and tutorial directly from me at darlingleatherandfur.com so that I can continue making new patterns and tutorials. Okay, let's get started. So once you've printed out the pattern, you're going to want to check the scale square. You need to make sure it's 1 inch this way and 1 inch this way, or you can check the 4 centimeter box if you do centimeters. The next thing to do is assemble the pattern, just like it is here in this little guide. So pages 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. And you can see that they are labeled with a big number right in the middle of the paper. And you'll need to cut off this excess here right on that line. And then match up these triangles to make a diamond. Tape it together. So same thing, I cut off that excess here, match up those triangles. And also, now that we have some pattern pieces going across the paper, we can make sure those pattern lines match up nicely. If you don't want to use tape, you can use glue stick to glue the pages together. If you want a more sturdy pattern, you can print out right on a cardstock or a resume paper, whatever your printer will allow. Some of the printers won't print on heavy cardstock paper. Or you can print it out on regular paper like this and cut out your size and glue it onto poster board, then cut it out, and then you'll have some really sturdy, long-lasting patterns. And once we get here, we'll need to cut off the top of this one, page number 5. Notice we just have this little piece from the extra large size that we need to make sure we get on there. And on this one, page number 6, we need to cut off this side and the top so that it'll fit right in there. So this one we need to make sure we match up that diamond and the side diamond. And this one doesn't have any pattern pieces going across this line, so you don't really need to tape it there. You can if you want to. And for this one, again, we don't have anything going across there, so you don't even really have to cut off that top. Okay, so now we have pages 1 through 8, and you can continue taping out the entire thing all at once, but I find that gets pretty unmanageable and just annoying when you go to cut it out. So at this point, I'm going to cut out this piece and the size chart and just get them separated. Not very precisely, just so that we don't have to deal with the whole pattern all together. And we don't actually have anything connecting here. So we don't really need to tape that piece together, although you can. Same thing all the way across here. None of the patterns connect across that line, so we don't even have to tape anything to that line. We can just tape straight across. So 9 and 10 go together. And again, we don't have anything that crosses this line, so you don't even have to tape these two layers together. So the last two pages, 13 and 14. I'm just going to separate some of these pieces. So the next thing you need to figure out is what size you want to make. If you're making the mittens for yourself, then you put your hand here, measure across knuckles. That's going to be right across the line of my knuckles, and hopefully you can see that I'm within that extra small size, the adult extra small. If you're making mittens for someone you have in the household, measure their hand. If you're making like a mail order pair of mittens for someone, then have them send you a hand tracing. And keep in mind that the hand tracing usually is a little bit bigger than their actual hand. So something to keep in mind, the size chart is approximate, and factors such as the lining fabric thickness and seam allowance variation will affect the final fit. So it's important to use the recommended seam allowance and use it consistently, because if you change the seam allowance, it will change how the mittens fit and throw off the size chart. It is recommended to make a trial mitten from non-stretch outer fabric and the mitten lining fabric to test fit before making a fur pair of mittens. So before you even make a fur pair of mittens, you check your size and then you make a test mitten. Use some sort of a non-stretch fabric for the outside of the mitten, and then for the lining, you use whichever lining you want to use in your fur mittens. So this pattern is drafted for a close-fitting mitten lined with fleece fabric. If you're between sizes, size up. If you prefer a loose fit, size up. If you're using a thicker lining, you may also need to size up. So I've done 2 trial mittens, one with a fleece lining and one with a wool lining. And the one with the wool lining does fit a little bit more snug, and I happen to be the same size with a wool lining and with a fleece lining. But because the wool is thicker, it does take up more space and make the mitten feel smaller. So that's important to do. It's important to use whichever lining in your trial mitten that you're going to use in your final mitten. And if you make the trial mitten and it's a good fit, you can even just use the lining. Just pull this out and use it in your final mitten. You don't have to sew a new lining if the fit is correct. If the fit is not correct, let's say for me, I have short fingers and a wide wrist. Let's pretend that this mitten is too long in the fingers, longer than I want in the fingers, and it's too tight in the wrist. So you can adjust the size and make a custom size according to what you need. That was the adult extra small, which is the light blue adult extra small. And I want the fingers to be shorter. So all we need to do is go from the extra small line down to the next size down, and just make a gentle curve there along the side. It doesn't have to be perfect. And then when you cut out the size, you're going to cut along that extra small adult size and follow the line you drew down to the next size. And that's going to give you shorter fingertips on the mitten than if you stayed with that extra small size. And let's also say I want it wider on the wrist. I found the mitten was too tight on the wrist and I want to make it wider because I have wide wrists. You just do basically the same thing. Go from about this point out to this next size up because we want to make it wider. And then down there. And that's how you would make the wrist wider. Of course, you can do the opposite, trace down to the smaller size if you want the wrist narrower. And if you want the fingers longer, trace up to the next size, or 2 if you have really long fingers. So that's how you customize the mittens according to your size, but you need to make a test mitten first to know what adjustments you have to make. Also, you should also test the scale square on the pattern piece to make sure that that's correct also, and that is. And then once you've determined what size you want to make, cut out your size. So for the pair of mittens I'm going to make today, I'm going to do an adult size large with no adjustments. So I'm going to follow that orange line all the way around. I'm going to be using 2 medium beaver pelts to make this pair of gauntlet mittens today. We have some repairs to do and some prep work to do before they're blocked. I'll start with this one. You're going to need a furrier knife or another cutting utensil like scalpel or a box cutter with a fresh blade, something like that. The furrier knives and blades you can order from Samuel Bauer online. Actually, not online, you have to call to order. But beaver pelts are already split open when you get them from the tannery, usually. So you don't have to cut it open. If you have a pelt that's case skinned, you're almost always going to split it up the belly. So with beaver pelts, I always start by splitting open the legs. All 4. Because that area around the outside almost acts as a rubber band to constrict the pelt. So, I mean, you can see even right here, just with that split, how much that opens up. And that'll get even wider when you block the pelt. It relieves a lot of the strain that's holding the pelt tight so that you can stretch it wider when you're blocking it. And then I cut off the face. And I usually try and leave as much of the cheek as I can because the cheeks are nice fur. So you want to leave some cheek. Cut right behind the ears. And then back up that cheek again. I'm not going to worry about that little spot, but these ones will need repairing. And we also need to look at the fur side for any bald spots or places where there was a hair slip or a scar. That's not visible from the hide side. I don't see anything extra on this pelt, but sometimes you can't find it until after it's blocked. An interesting thing to notice is, even though these holes are pretty big, it's hard to even see them from the hair side. So this one is small enough that we can repair it with knee lips. And I'm gonna do a drop repair. This hide's really thick right here, so that's gonna come out. These lines that go with the lay of the hair to be parallel with the lay of the hair. These top and bottom lines can be kind of in parallelogram shape, or they can be square. Take it down to about here. And then there's just a couple tiny holes here. And the nipples, all beaver pelts have those little nipple holes. So we're going to cut those out, tiny little ellipses. These, I'm just going to put a couple machine stitches in there. They're not really big enough to cut out. I'm just going to put a couple machine stitches in there just to reinforce those areas a little bit. And once you have that out, check the edges to make sure you got out all of the damaged area. If there's a little bald spot there, I'd go back and cut it a little bit wider. So this one is a little bit different. Cut out the damaged area. And when you cut, you're only using the very tip of the blade to go through the hide so that you're not cutting off hairs. If you push the blade all the way into the hide and you're using way back here for your cutting edge, you're going to cut off a lot of hairs and you will see where you made your cuts because there will be missing hair on the hair side. Okay, so there's our damaged area. Make sure we got all of it. Good. And I'm going to leave that attached just a little bit so that I don't lose that piece. And then when I get to the machine, I'm going to pop it off. And then this edge gets sewn up here. And then you sew those sides. But the reason you leave that attached is so you don't have an extra piece laying around that you need to keep track of. It's just attached to the pelt. And then also if you were doing multiple drop repairs throughout the pelt and you had them all loose, you might get them mixed up and then not know where they go. So this keeps everything organized. Okay, so I'm going to take it to the fur sewing machine and do the repairs. For hand sewing, you can hand sew the whole mitten project if you don't have a fur sewing machine. I'm going to demonstrate how to hand sew on these scraps, but I'm going to sew the mittens on my fur sewing machine. You'll need a thread. This is a polyester upholstery weight thread from Joann Fabrics. Upholstery weight's a good idea. Polyester or bonded nylon are good choices. You don't want cotton for sewing your gloves together. Cotton deteriorates pretty fast when it gets wet, and the edges of your mittens are likely to get wet if you're wearing them in the snow. You also need glover's needles. I like size 3, 003, and these needles have a sharp cutting edge on them. It makes it a lot easier to sew the hide compared to a regular needle with just a regular point. So you'll need some thread, generally 2 to 3 times the length of your project. If you're sewing something small like this though, get some extra. You also might want some beeswax or any other kind of wax really to wax your thread. If you wax your thread, it'll help to keep a tighter stitch as you sew. So it's not necessary, but it's an option. Just take your thread, run it through your wax like that, and now it's waxed thread. To tie a knot, I'm going to make a loop, and then I'm going to take that little tail and move it around the loop. That was 1, 2, 3, 4 times, and then pull the knot tight, and that gives a pretty good size knot. And then I'm going to put the needle on the other end. And I prefer threading my needles this way as opposed to doubling up the thread and knotting the thread tails together. Because if you do it this way, if you place a stitch and you don't like it, in order to remove that stitch, you have to cut the thread to get the needle off, and then start over. So if you are sewing with a single strand with your knot on the end like this, if you make a mistake, you just pull the needle off the thread, pull the thread out of the project for that one stitch, put the needle back on, and keep sewing, which I'll show when I'm sewing. So once you have your fur ready to sew, you put it right side to right side, fur to fur or fur to leather. I'm going to make sure your edges line up, and I'm going to clip it every inch or so. And I'm left-handed, so it's going to be a left-handed sewing tutorial. If you're right-handed, hopefully you can figure it out. We're not going to start right at the end and sew across. We're going to start about a 1/2 inch from the end, and I'm using an 1/8 inch seam allowance, which means the needle is going in an 1/8 inch from that edge. I'm going to sew this way to start with. thread always wants to get caught on the clips. Okay, so I made it to the end, and now I'm going to sew this way. And because this needle has a cutting edge on it, if you go too close to your thread while you're sewing your previous thread, you can cut those threads. So you want to make sure you're stitching in between the previous stitches and not right on top of them. Doing it this way gives more strength to the end of the seam. If you had started here, your knot would be right here, and that would be a weak point when there's stress on this part of the seam. That knot might pull right through the hide, but because the knot's way over there, it's never going to pull through that hide when there's strain on the end of the seam. I like to use leather thimbles. This is a leather one from Clover on my middle finger. So my middle finger is pushing the needle, and my thumb and pointer finger are directing the needle. So you can try whatever kind of thimbles you want and see what feels best for you. Make sure you're pulling that thread tight with each stitch. And I'm maintaining that 1/8" seam allowance, and my stitches are about 1/8 inch apart. Keep pushing that fluff back down in the seam. Some areas it wants to pop up more than others. It is tricky, but with some patience, you'll get the hang of it pretty fast. It is important to maintain an 1/8" seam allowance. If your seam allowance is larger or smaller, it will affect the fit of the mitten. You also might want to wear a thimble on the fingers that are not sewing. So it's pretty easy to poke your finger on the other side of the hide when you put the needle through, and these things go deep. Okay, we fought the fluff. We're almost to the end. Okay, and ooh, it's not as pretty on that side, is it? That's okay. It's functional. That's what we're going for. Functional if you're hand sewing. Again, we're not going to put the knot right on the end of the seam because any strain on it will make that knot a weak point. So we're going to back stitch again, 3 or 4 stitches. Okay, make sure that's nice and tight. So let's say you make a stitch there, and you're really not happy with that, and you want to take it out. Because you're using a single thread and there's no knot here, take your needle off, and then I like to use the blunt end of my needle to get under that stitch and pull it out. So that's the benefit of sewing with a single thread. Normally when I'm sewing, I put the needle under a previous loop of thread to tie the knot. I'm not going to do that with this Glover's needle though, because I'm likely to cut the thread. In fact, I'll show you here. You can cut right through the thread with this needle, which you definitely don't want to do. So for your knot, instead of going under that thread, you're going to go through a little bit of the hide in a place where there's no thread, just a little bit, and pull the needle through which gives you one loop. So you're going to put your needle through that loop, and then you have another loop here. So you're going to put your needle through that loop also. I kind of think of this as a figure 8 knot. I don't actually know if it's called that. And then you have to pull it slowly to get the knot right on the hide. If you pull it too fast, sometimes the knot ends up like out here. And we're going to do one more for security. Again, needle through a little bit of that hide and pull it until you have one loop. Put the needle through that loop, and then you have a second loop. Put your needle through the second loop. You have your little wonky figure 8. Pull that slowly until it knots. And if you want to be extra secure, you can put a little dot of fray block or any other kind of glue on that knot, and that'll make it extra secure so it'll never come undone. You do want these stitches to be tight so that when you flip your mitten right side out, that seam allowance stays sewn together like this and doesn't flatten out like that, because that will change the fit of the mitten, and it'll also let a little bit more air through the seams if they're flat, which would make the mitten a little breezy. There you go. It's called a whip stitch. That's what you will use if you're hand sewing your mittens. So I'm going to do these repairs on my first sewing machine. This is my Texo 202, and I'm using a 100 weight New Bedford cotton thread from Samuel Bauer. If you don't have this, you can use whatever you have that you like. I like this for repairs. I will use a heavier duty thread for sewing the mitten pattern pieces together. So this is where we took out that ellipse. I'm gonna match up those edges, get the hair inside, and then sew it closed. Turn on the machine first. This is another tool from Samuel Bauer. I think they call it a hair guider. So there's one repair done. I'm gonna do these other little ones. And these are those little tiny holes, and I'm just gonna put in a few stitches around them just to reinforce them a little bit. And then we have the drop repair. So I'm just gonna pull that off the bottom. And then match this up across the top. I'm going to sew it across the top first. If I'm having a lot of trouble keeping those hairs inside, I'll actually sew up the edges first and then do across the top last. But this one's not too bad. Hard to get those little corners. Just take some finagling. Okay, now it's sewn across the top. I'm going to sew down one side. This is a tricky part. I'm going to sew all the way down to the bottom of the opening, but it's tricky because of that little point of the drop there. So you just do the best you can to get everything and not have any holes there and not have a big bump where that point is. You can see this edge is a little bit longer than this edge. So I'm going to use the wheel, push on this outside wheel, which is going to pull this edge that's closer to me that way while the other edge stays in place. And it just eases in that extra length that it had there. And now that's done. It's a little bubbly now, but it'll look really good after it's blocked. From the fur side, you can barely see where that repair was done, and it'll be even more hidden after it's blocked. I'm going to get the pelt ready for blocking. So we're going to get it wet with water first. This pelt, you can tell, is a little bit older. It's a little yellow, and it just feels dry. A freshly tanned pelt will be more white, and it feels a little bit more moist. So I'm going to use water first and let that absorb. And then I'm going to use a diluted ease leather from Samuel Bauer, which just helps reintroduce some oils and softening agents to get that back into this older pelt. So I like to use a big chemical sprayer for the water. You can use a spray bottle, or you can dip a brush. This is just a shoe brush. Dip a brush in a bowl of water and spread it on that way. Whatever you want to do. It tends to bead up, so if you have a brush, it's nice to rub the water in a little bit, or you can just use your hand to spread it out. But you definitely don't have to use a brush for it. It's just an option. If you're doing a lot of them, it's nice. Fold that in half. hide to hide. And then roll it up and put it in a bag for 10 minutes or so. Let that water absorb. I'm going to take out the pelts and give them a spray down with the ease leather. And again, I only use this on pelts that feel dry or older. Brush that in too. If you don't have a brush, you can use your hands to smooth it around. A lot of times I cut off the bottom part of a beaver pelt because it's very thick right on the end, and that will impede stretch. Even a little bit more right here. Just doesn't get thinned right there at the tannery very much. Let me spray this a little more. And we'll put it back in the bag to sit for a while. Okay. I'll let that sit in there for another 20 minutes or so. It's definitely feeling like it's getting there. I'm gonna give it a little stretch, which seems to help the moisture absorb faster by stretching out those fibers in the hide and giving it more space to go into. And I'm being careful that I'm not pulling too hard because I don't want the hide to get stretched too much. At this stage, it could tear if I pull too hard. So we're just gently stretching it out all over. Okay, I'm going to give it one more spray with plain water just to help kind of drive in that ease leather that I put on, give it a little bit more moisture. Okay, I'll roll this up and let this sit for a good solid half an hour this time. Thinner pelts or pelts that are newer, fresher, not as old as this one, will take less time for the water to absorb. sat for another half an hour to let the moisture soak in. It feels very moist right now. Feels really good. So I'm going to give it a little stretching before the blocking. Stretch it widthwise and lengthwise. And the reason we block pelts before sewing is to get all the wrinkles out of the pelts so that it's nice and flat, and it increases the size. It increases the surface area by about 15%, which is about how much tanning shrinks the pelts. So it's going to take that pelt back to the size it was when it was trapper dried. And I have the pattern pieces we're going to need. And the second pelt. Just had all the same stuff done to it. We're going to look at these pelts and decide which one we want for the top of the mitten and which one we want for the underside of the mitten. I'm going to use this one for the top because it's a little bit fluffier. Looks a little bit denser. Yeah. I want the fluffier one on the top. But if you're making your own pair of mittens, use your judgment to decide which pelt you'll use for the top, or if you have one pelt, then you don't have to choose. And you always want to have your pattern pieces ready so that you can make sure you're stretching the pelt to a size that will fit the pattern pieces. I seem to always forget to mark my center until I get to this point. It's better to mark your center line before the pelts are wet, but for some reason, now is the time when I always end up doing it. Beaver don't have a super defined center line, so you generally just look for the darkest area and put a mark here. The darkest area, I'm going to put a mark here. Grab your yardstick and a Sharpie and draw your line. I'll do the other one too. Back to one to use for the top of the mittens. Now I need to get this piece to fit here without crossing the center line, and this piece to fit here without crossing the center line. And you'll notice on the pattern it says cut to mirror image. That's what it means. So you cut one this way, flip it over, which is the mirror image, and the other one is that way. This little bump out here is the thumb side of the mitten, and I like to have the thumb side towards the center back, but you can do it the other way if you want to. I like this new Master electric stapler. It has an adjustable power setting so that when it's turned all the way down and I put a staple in the board, it sticks up a little bit so that it's easy to get my staple puller underneath it. I like to take out staples like that. You can just use kind of a light duty utility stapler also, but that one does drive the staples right into the board, which makes them a little harder to get out. And the board I'm stapling to is called a homosote board. It's a pressed cellulose or pressed paper board that's about a 1/2 inch thick. It's used usually for soundproofing, and it's becoming more difficult to find. You might not be able to find it. I bought mine at Home Depot years ago, and they're working on selling out their stock, and then they're not going to carry it anymore. It comes 4 foot by 8 foot, and I cut mine into thirds so that I can use a third at a time. And I drew the lines on it just for guidelines. If you can't find it, you can use plywood. It's just harder to get the staples out of plywood, and plywood is heavier to pick up and move around. So if you don't want to commit to buying homosote board or plywood, you could stack up a few layers of cardboard and staple right into cardboard. If you're only going to make one pair of mittens, that would be the way to do it. First thing I do is line up my center line on the bottom with the line on my board. And then I stretch a little bit, staple out that bottom edge. Then after that, I'm going to stretch the top just until it's taut. Staple that, making sure I line up my drawn line with the line on my board, and then stretch to the sides, staple there. Check the pattern as we go along. So we're closer to getting that length that we need. We don't really need much more width here, so I'm not going to stretch this pelt very wide. Pelts are kind of like a finger trap. If you stretch them lengthwise, they shrink in the width. If you stretch them widthwise, they shrink in the length. So we're going to do a little bit of both to get some more length down here. You do always want to stretch it symmetrically. And I have this guideline here, so I'm looking at how far I stapled on that side, trying to match it on this side. And then it's going to have to get wider as we go down, which is good because the pelt is naturally wider at the bottom anyway. You can see now we have the length that I need, and I just need more width. Let's check that. That's good. Actually, that needs to be a little bit wider there. But I'm going to do the other side, and then I will will tweak it to get it just right. That needs to be wider. Length is good. That's what we need there. This side needs to come out more. So we've bowed that line out. So pull it back this way a little bit. Bring it back a little bit. And then I'm going to go back through, pull the rest out, and get this looking a little bit better here and here. It's always some tweaking involved. Okay, that side looks good. That side looks good. This piece down here could be used with the tail end of the other one for a koozie or a can cooler. You want to stretch it enough to get all the wrinkles out and so that it's taut. You don't want to overstretch, but you really have to pull hard to get it overstretched. This is good. Still a little bit of looseness in it. As it dries, these little puckers will come out. That'll dry nice and flat. If you're using Homosoap board or plywood, you can flip the boards over and staple pelts on both sides. So again, starting at the bottom at that center line, stretch, staple next to that, stretch, staple next to that, pull up, and I'm just going to take a peek here. We definitely need some width. I really don't need any length, so I'm not putting any tension on it when I pull up. It really doesn't need to be any longer. I'm just going to do one staple at the top there for now. I want the thumb towards the center line. Definitely don't need any extra width up here. We need extra width towards the bottom. So I'm just going to pull that till it's a little taut. side. We've got it there too. Crosses that middle line a little bit, but it's some extra room on that side. Okay, so that's good. Go around the whole thing, staple down loose edges. Now this pelt would have stretched quite a bit more if we needed it to. You can pull down here, could have pulled up there, pulled it out wider, but we didn't need it to. We just got what we needed. It just varies by species and the size of the pelt. There's a lot of variables. If you do find that you need to cut up the pattern, usually I cut it right where that indent is. When you trace it out, you'd add just an 1/8 inch seam allowance at each place so that when you sew it together, you're not making it any shorter. I'm going to take this board off the table, stand it up against the wall so that my table space is clear, and let these pelts dry overnight. They'll be ready to go tomorrow. This dried overnight. It's nice and dry now. And we're going to get the staples out. I like to use one of these magnetic screw holders. This one's from Harbor Freight to pick up all my staples. And always lift up your pelt slowly once the staples are out, because a lot of times you'll find you missed one. And if you lift it up too fast, you could rip a hole in the pelt. Another pelt is on the other side of this board. So we're gonna flip it over and then take out these staples. And you can see this is where we did a repair. It's nice and flat now. There we go. And that pelt looks really good. You can't even see where that repair is. It's right here. And that looks perfect. And this tool is from Amazon. It's a staple puller or a tack puller, for generally used for upholstery, but this one's my favorite for pulling out staples. Now I have my pattern piece. This is the pelt that I want for the top of the mittens, and I have the top of the mitten pattern. And I like the hair flow to go down this way. Some people like the hair flow to go towards the fingertips, and that's just a personal preference, and in some cases depends on what you're using the mittens for. So I'm going to eyeball this here, make sure I have plenty of space for both sides of the mitten. I like to use these big washers as pattern weights to hold my pattern down. As I'm tracing around, I'm going to be marking little hash marks to match up with those. And those are going to help us when we're sewing the mitten together to make sure that we match up those marks on each piece and nothing ends up crooked. And then here, I'm gonna mark little triangles. That's where our triangle marks are. And that's where I'm going to be adding in the ring that the lanyard can clip to. Those hash marks on the bottom too. Okay. Before I forget, I'm gonna go back and add all the hash marks in on the pattern piece, because if we cut out this piece right now, these marks won't be on the pattern. And then cut 2 mirror image. So that's 1. This is the mirror image. This is piece 2, mirror image. And that looks good. We have just enough space right there. And we don't have these hash marks on this side of the piece of paper. So when I hold it up a little bit, I can see it through the paper. I'm going to mark them so that I don't miss them. There we go. There's this piece here. Use for a set of earmuffs if you wanted to. It's a little narrow for can cooler, but if you had an extra scrap to put next to it, you could get a little can cooler from there. Now we're going to do the underside of the mitten, and I always like to have the thumb side towards the center of the hide. Check and make sure we have enough room on both sides. We do. For this one, those marks all get really close to each other, so I need to look for the color that I'm tracing. Okay. The next thing I'm going to do is cut out the pieces. And I use a furrier knife, which you can buy from Samuel Bauer. It has replaceable blades. You can get those if you want to. Otherwise, you can use a scalpel. Just about any style blade you like. These curved ones are pretty good. There's an angled one that's nice. I don't really like the traditional rounded ones as much, or even a utility knife, box cutter with a sharp blade in it. When you're cutting, you want to make sure you're only using the tip of your blade to cut the hide. If you push your blade all the way through the hide and you're cutting back here, you're going to be cutting a lot of hair. So when you use just the tip of the blade, it's going to minimize how much hair is being cut. And you want to make sure you're lifting the pelt off the table slightly. You're not holding it down and pressing onto the table and dragging your knife across. lifting it off the table slightly, making sure that knife's never touching the table. And we have some leftover fur from this pelt, so that could be used for earmuffs. Sew those pieces together and have a little koozie. Same thing with this. But for now, we'll just set those aside. There you go. These are all cut out. And the next thing I like to do is work on getting off the loose hairs, because there's always going to be some loose hairs that got cut that tend to just turn into fluff and fly up your nose if you leave them there. So this is a clothing brush to remove hair from clothing. Just got it at the drugstore, and you can use it to help remove some of that loose hair from the edges. That's all on the fur for now. I like to use a buckskin leather for the palms. Whatever you use, just make sure it's a soft and flexible leather. If you want thicker, you can do a cowhide or a moose hide. So I've already used this for other projects, but the first thing you want to do is look at your leather and see if there's any areas that you need to avoid. Holes or blemishes that you don't want. In this case, there's a little bit of a difference in the dye on this part, so I'm going to avoid this part of the hide. And this part looks good, except it's a little darkness in this corner. So I'm going to use this area here. And I like a gel pen for tracing pattern pieces on leather. It's good for darker colored leathers. It shows up really well. So I always want to plan this out so that I can use the most hide with the least amount of waste. I'm avoiding this big dark spot in the corner, and I'm avoiding that little hole. Test my pen, make sure it's working. That looks good. And I'm tracing on the right side of the leather, which means the leather side that's going to show in the finished pair of mittens. So I do need to be careful that I'm not making any marks away from the seam allowance, because those will show on the finished mitten. And I don't want to make any marks on the rest of the pelt or the rest of the hide, because then it'll show if I use it for other projects. So marking my hash marks with just a very small mark that will stay in the seam allowance and not show on the finished mitten. The other option is to trace your pieces on the back side, because then whatever marks you make won't show. But the gel pen doesn't work as well on the suede side of the leather. Again, go through and mark these. You can use a good pair of scissors to cut those out. I like to use a rotary blade. If you're using a rotary blade, you have to make sure you're using a cutting mat underneath it. And I always wear a glove on my non-cutting hand so I don't slice off parts of my fingers. There we go. Here's our palm pieces, 2 mirror images. I'm going to set those aside for now. This is going to be for the loops for your D-rings. Just never works as well on the suede side, but I'll give you enough to see where you need to cut. And these edges are angled so that when you fold it like that, it makes a straight line. And that place where we marked the triangles is where these are going to be attached. So they're going to be sewn in there. I always like to reinforce this with some cold tape. This is an adhesive fabric tape that you can get from a furrier supply store. I think it's also pretty similar to what people put on hockey stick handles, so you could use that instead if you wanted to. Cold tape is controversial. It can be used to reinforce the hide and reinforce seams, but it is not recommended for long wear items. The adhesive will eat away at the hide in about 20 years. That seems to be the lifespan of cold tape. So this is going to reinforce that seam right there. Give it some extra strength and extra support. But it's only going to last for 20 years, and in 20 years, it will start to deteriorate the hide. So I would never recommend using cold tape on blankets or coats or vests or anything that's large and could be remodeled into something else. The lifespan of a pair of mittens, in my experience, is only about 10 years because of how they're used and how they're worn and the conditions they're used in. They're going to get wet and they're going to dry, and that'll weaken the hide. So I'm fine with using cold tape to reinforce mittens if it's needed. On a good thick beaver hide, you won't even need it. On thinner hides like fox or muskrat, you would want it there where you're attaching the lanyard strap, the lanyard attachment, just because they're going to be hanging. The weight of the mittens is going to be hanging there by that seam, and it'll give it extra strength so that that doesn't tear off. If the hide's really thin, sometimes I'll put a piece to reinforce that thumb area, but these ones don't need it. And I like that with this white cold tape, I can still see my marks through it. Okay, so we have our two top pieces, our two underside pieces, our two palm pieces, and our two lanyard pieces. And then we need some hardware. You can use D-rings or O-rings. I like the O-rings better because they're not going to spin around. A D-ring sometimes twists and then kind of defeats the purpose of a D-ring. The O-rings just work a little better, I think, because it doesn't matter if they spin. So we're going to set those aside for now. And when you're sewing, you need to make sure that you're sewing what we call right side to right side, which is the side that will be showing when the item is finished. You sew right side, and then you turn it inside out, and that way the seams are inside the item. And I always start by sewing around the thumb. Sometimes I clip before I'm sewing. Usually I don't, especially if I have notches to match up. I just match those up as I'm sewing. But if you want to clip, I like these sewing clips. And you can clip at each of your marks to keep things together. If you're hand sewing, it's definitely easier if you clip it all up first. You can also use little binder clips, just the metal ones that you can get anywhere. On my Texel machine, I'm using a size 11 needle and size 46-pound bonded nylon thread, which is like an upholstery weight thread. It's heavier than a regular home sewing machine thread, but not super duper heavy. You don't really need a super heavyweight thread for sewing fur because the hide will rip before even this thread would break. I like this thread for mittens because it has a higher abrasion resistance, which you'll want around the edges of the mittens. If you're having trouble on your fur sewing machine with skipped stitches, try a smaller size needle with the thread that you're using and try smaller and smaller and smaller until you find something that works. Before, when I was having trouble with skipped stitches, it seemed to be because the needle I was using was too big. So that's the thread. I do have the tension pretty high, so it's going to give a tight stitch to hold the pieces together. because I want to maintain that 1/8 inch seam allowance even when the mitten is turned inside out. And I have my stitch distance set to a bit less than an 1/8 inch between stitches. And it's on my machine, I can make the distance between stitches wider or narrower. And it's not really like I set it to an 1/8 of an inch. So you'll just have to play with your machine to figure that out. And I'm going to be sewing from here up around the thumb and then stopping at this point. And I want 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. And when I start sewing, I like to take that thread and hold it over to the side to keep it out of the way, and it kind of seals off that end. And I like to just hand wheel the first couple stitches just to make sure everything's where I want it before I get going with the machine. I like to use this hair guide tool to push the hair down as I'm sewing. And you do need to make sure you're using the 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. If you're not, the mitten size will not come out accurate to the pattern. When you're sewing stretchy leather to the hide, you'll notice that the leather wants to stretch, and that's making my marks off balance here. There's a mark, and that needs to match up with this one. So what I'm going to do while I'm sewing is push the leather forward a little bit so that I'm taking out some of that extra length of the leather because it's stretching. And now our marks are closer. I have one mark there and one mark there. So that by the time I get to those marks, they will meet up. And they do. Now they're meeting up. And as I'm sewing around this thumb, I'm going to keep kind of pushing that leather back towards the needle to compensate for the leather that wants to stretch. And go nice and slow around this curve. It's a tricky spot. And again, down here, the leather wants to stretch past the fur, because this point is supposed to meet up with this point. So I'm making sure I'm pushing that leather to compensate for the stretching. Now we're getting closer and it's almost matching up. I'm going to sew right to that point. And we'll leave a nice long thread tail. And I'm just going to leave that for now. We don't need to backstitch. I'll tie this off with the other threads once we've sewn this to the top side of the mitten. You can see there the stitching is nice and tight. You're not seeing that stitching in there at all. So now we have this sewn on, and we can sew the top of the mitten to it. And we need to make sure we're matching up the correct pieces together. This is not correct. This is the thumb side of this piece. And we would not be able to sew these right sides together. That's the wrong piece. And this is the one we want. So we have the thumb side here. When these are right side together, these thumbs match up. And then I also need an O-ring. We need to put the O-ring in now. For attaching the leather loop and the O-ring or D-ring, you fold it so that the ends are next to each other, not overlapping, next to each other, and then line it up on the right side of the mitten or the fur side with those triangles that you marked. And there's two reasons for doing it like this instead of lining up the ends of the leather like that, which would be the more obvious way to do it. One is it reduces bulk in the seam. So if you sew it this way, you're sewing over 2 layers of leather, whereas this way, it's only 1 layer at a time. So it reduces bulk and it increases the strength because it increases the surface area of what's sewn. So that's only 1 inch wide. You sew that to the mitten, you have 1 inch of stitching holding it there with the mittens hanging from it. When you sew it this way, you have 2 inches of stitches holding that loop in place, so it gives it double the strength. And that's going to go here. That has to go inside where you're sewing against the fur, so that after the mitten is sewn, it'll be on the fur side. So I usually clip it to one side, matching up those marks, and reclip. Try and get as much fur down as you can. And make sure that the leather doesn't sink too far down in there. What I'm going to do is sew from here to here and then stop. You cannot sew across this point. You have to stop there. And then I'm going to sew from here all the way around to here and then stop. I'm going to make sure as I'm sewing that these marks are matching up, that this indent is matching up on each side, and that the points are matching up. Try and get all the hair down there. Definitely go slow across here. And make sure that that leather doesn't get too low. So to that point. Now I'm going to start on this point, sew around the mitten, and I'm making sure that I'm matching up all of my marks as I go along. And you'll notice that this mark doesn't have a corresponding mark on this side, This mark is what matches up with this seam. I'm going to go ahead and put a clip here. It's also a good idea to clip up every mark all the way around. If you're starting out, it helps with the fur handling when you're sewing. As I'm sewing, I'm making adjustments to basically the tensions of each side. If this side is too long, I push it this way and sew it through, and that gets rid of the excess length on this side. If this side's too long, you push it forward like that. I can also push it with the wheel to get rid of a little extra length on the side closest to me. And I'm going to do that a bit as I'm getting up to this spot, because there is a little bit of extra length on the side closest to me, right through here. So I'm going to do just a little bit, pushing that wheel to use up that extra length. And now, pulling both sides tight, that mark is matching right up with that seam. Then I'm going to look ahead to my next mark and see how that's looking. Depending on how much I pull this leather, it's matching up or it's ahead a lot. So I need to make sure I'm not stretching the leather as I'm sewing, and I'm going to put a little pressure on this wheel to make sure that that leather is not stretching. And looking at the next mark, that one's gotten ahead a little bit. So I'm going to use this wheel to take up some of the slack with the leather. When I do that, when I push the wheel, I'm also opening them ever so slightly with my foot on that pedal, just to give it room to squeeze that leather to the side. Looking ahead at this mark, that's off a little bit. So I'm going to adjust and adjust a little bit again. And a little more. And looking ahead at the next one, that one's going to be off a little bit too. We're stopping at that point. If we sew across right here where that thumb is, it's going to sew that thumb to the lower side of the mitten. There's not a way to sew past that thumb. So we stop right at that point of the thumb. Take it off. And we made sure we left the thread tail fairly long. So we're going to take these thread tails here. There's 3. I'm going to group 2 together and then square knot them. Right over left, left over right. And I don't want the knot super duper tight against the hide. We're going to do it again, right over left, left over right. There we go. And that'll keep those thread tails secure. If you have any long thread tails down on these ends, you can trim those off so they're a little shorter. And then we can turn the mitten right side out. Usually do the thumb first, and the rest of the mitten. And then you need to go through and press all the seams so that they're nice and smooth. And if you're making a small pair of mittens, like for a kid, and you can't get your fingers up in there to turn it out, you can use a marker or a pen, especially in the thumb area, to press those seams outward. The next thing we're going to do is sew the binding onto the mitten. I like to use 1 1/4 wide twill tape. It's a cotton ribbon that is nice and sturdy. You can use leather if you want to. And we don't need this to be exact. We don't have to have an exact measurement for it. I usually just keep it attached to the roll as I'm sewing, sew it around, and then cut it off when you get to the end. If you were using leather, cut out 1 1/2 inch wide strips of leather and use those the same way. Twill tape is easier if you're hand sewing because it's easier to hand sew for the finish on the lining. So I have my roll of twill tape. I'm just going to set that over to the side and my mitten. And I always start on the underside in the middle. So that's our middle hash mark. And you need to sew it on the right side of the fur. So you're putting your twill tape against the fur. If you were using leather, you would need to make sure you had the right sides together. So your shiny side of your leather towards the fur. We're going to put that on the machine. And then the same way we sewed the rest of it. We use about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. The seam allowance isn't as important on the twill tape. Once you get back to your starting point, you're going to eyeball about 1 inch of overlap. And then cut the twill tape and be very careful not to cut any fur. And then this, you can cut short. It's going to end up sandwiched under this twill tape, so it's not going to unravel or go anywhere. You can see once you have this twill tape sewn on and then folded down away from the fur, you can't see the seam because the seam will be inside. So it's time to cut out your lining fabric. For this pair of mittens, I'm using a blanket wool, which is just a wool blanket. You'll lay out your fabric. And you'll need to cut to mirror image. So remember, that means you cut one like this, flip it over, cut another one like that. And generally try to arrange it on the fabric so that you get the best use of space, but you also follow the grain line. All fabric has a grain line, which is the direction that the fibers are woven. So when you weave fibers together, they go perpendicular to each other. So when you're placing the lining on the fabric, you can't have it crooked according to the grain line. You need to have it matching the grain line. The edge of the fabric will be on the straight of grain. So you want to make sure that your pattern piece is parallel, or if you want, perpendicular to the grain line. Just make sure that you're consistent. If you cut some pieces with the grain line going this way and some pieces with the grain line going this way, it's just going to feel weird. Because even a woven fabric, if it doesn't have any sort of reinforcement on the back, will have some degree of light stretch to it. And there's more stretch on the cross grain, which is like diagonal, than there is on the straight grain. When I cut out patterns, I like to use pattern weights and a rotary blade for cutting. I'll show you on the next piece an alternative to doing that. So if you are using a rotary blade, you have to have a cutting mat on your table or you'll cut into your table. So first, you'll want to mark your pattern markings. This is Taylor's chalk. It's just a thin piece of chalk. You could use regular chalk. You could use a washable marker if your fabric is a color where marker will show up. You can even use a thin sliver of soap. We're just going to mark those and then cut out the pattern piece. I like a rotary cutter because I find it to be the fastest way to cut out fabric, but it does mean you have to buy more things. You have to buy the cutter, you have to buy the mat. If you want to be safe, then not Teflon, what is this? Anti-cutting glove. So the other way to do it is to use scissors, which I will show next after we transfer these marks. If you don't have a rotary cutter or a mat, then you will pin your lining right to the pattern piece, or rather pin the pattern piece right to your lining. Okay, and then I always find it easier to do kind of a pre-cut where I'm cutting cutting that piece off away from the bulk of the fabric, but I haven't cut right next to the pattern. So then it's easier to pick up, and you need to make sure you're cutting right next to that pattern piece. To transfer these markings, just lift up the edge, put the marking right on the fabric that way. I do find a smaller rotary blade to be easier for going around tight curves like the thumb. So if you're only going to buy one rotary blade, I would recommend buying a smaller one because they're better for curves. I forgot to mark this one before cutting, so we'll do it this way. There we go. Now we have our lining, and we're going to sew along here first. And you can pin or clip the thumb together right where those marks are. And I'll pin again down here. There and there. So we need to sew using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. That's what it says on here, 1/4 seam allowance. Right along this edge, around the curve of the thumb, and then stopping at that point. And you can do it by hand, just with a regular sewing needles from Sewing Kit or whatever you can get from Joann Fabrics. And you can use the same thread that you used on your fur if you're hand sewing. In this case, I'm just using a white thread, so it's easy to see, but you'll want to use a thread that matches the color of your fabric if you have it. So to do the knot, make a loop, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 times around, and then pull that knot tight. And then thread the needle. And same as we did on the fur, we're going to start 1/2 inch or so away from this edge with our 1/4 inch seam allowance. So that's different than the fur. The fur uses an 1/8 inch seam allowance. This uses a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We're going to sew backwards. This is our back stitch. You do want to make sure you pull the thread nice and tight. And if your machine's sewing this, you can do it on the fur machine if you can get a 1/4 inch seam allowance on your fur machine, or you can sew it on a home sewing machine with a straight stitch. So you get the idea with that. You would sew all the way around, stopping once you get to the point, and then back stitch a few stitches. So do a few stitches in the other direction, crossing over what you've already sewn, and then go under previous loop of thread and take your needle through that loop you just made and then through that other loop you just made, and then pull it slowly to tighten. And then again, through that loop you just made, through the second loop you just made, and pull it nice and slow. That'll give you a good tight knot to finish, and you can put a dot of glue there for extra security if you want to. I'm going to be machine sewing my mitten linings, so I'll demonstrate that also. So for machine sewing the lining, I like to use my home sewing machine, and need to make sure we're using 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I like this little seam guide. And I can adjust where my needle is. So I adjust my needle over to make sure that it is 1/4 inch away from the edge of the fabric, which it is there. If you can't move your needle, then you just move the fabric so that it's 1/4 inch away from the needle. I like to have a long stitch, so I have my stitch length set to 5 millimeters, and I like to start about 1/2 inch away from the edge of the fabric and stitch backwards first and then continue forwards on the seam. And because this fabric is thick, it creates a slope on the foot. So the back of the sewing machine foot is right on the back of the machine, and then the front of the foot is lifted up 1/8 of an inch or more. So it's kind of tilted like this. And when I try to sew onto the fabric, it catches on the back of that foot and it's hard to get past it. So what I like to do to help with that is take a folded piece of leather. You can use folded fabric or a little stack of Post-it notes. And we just lift up that foot and put it under the back of the foot. And that's going to level out the sewing machine foot so it can sew smoothly onto this bulky fabric. And that will help you whenever you're sewing over bulky seams also. So now we're going to stitch forward along there, stopping when we get to that point. And maintaining that seam allowance the whole time. It's never a race, go as slow as you need to. I'm just lifting up to see if I'm at that point yet. I think I'm going to go one more stitch and then I'm going to back stitch. Okay, so now we have that part of our lining done. And I forgot to mention, I did match up those 2 chalk marks on the thumb when I was pinning it together. And now we can sew on the back piece of the lining. Make sure, I didn't do it, make sure that that little point, which is the thumb side, is on the thumb side. Your mitten, of the lining that you've already sewn. So it's hard to get the whole thing in the frame here. It lined up like that. We have this point lined up with the points here. And the first thing I'm going to do is line these up, clip them together, and sew from here to the point, and then back stitching and stopping. And we're just sewing right up to this point and stopping, but there is quite a bit of bulk in there because we have the seam from what we've already sewn. So just kind of press that down. You want to sew right up to that fold that's underneath, but not over it. And then back stitch. Okay, so that's looking good. And next, we're going to sew from here around, stopping here and back stitching. Again, we want to make sure we're matching up those chalk points at the top. And I like to open the seam allowance here so it gets sewn over flat. It can sometimes be hard to make sure that this stays flat. So if you have a little hair guider or just a seam ripper, you can push those down, make sure it stays flat. And there we go. We have our lining sewn. So you have your mitten lining done. Trim any excess threads that you have. And then put it in the mitten. And make sure everything's kind of smoothed out, not bunched up inside. If you're making a mitten that's smaller than your hands and you're not able to get your hand all the way inside of it to smooth out the lining, like if you're making a mitten for a child, you can take a marker and use the marker to get the lining into the thumb and into the palm, into the fingertips. Once you have your lining in your mitten, you're going to line up those marks that you made on your lining with the marks that you made on the bottom of your mitten. And you're going to extend the lining centimeter to 1/2 inch past the hide. So rather than lining it up with the hide like that, you're going to extend it up 1 centimeter to 1/2 inch, and then fold that twill tape or whatever binding you're using over the lining. And where your binding overlaps, it tends to look a little bit messy because the bottom one sticks out past the top one. So just fold that bottom one in a little bit and then put the top part over, and then it'll look nice and clean. So you're folding over that binding, and I like to use clips to hold it in place. And you're going to match up all those marks. Match up the side seam, the hide, and the lining. And I like to add a lot of clips so it really holds everything in place while I sew it. So the next thing I want to do is put in a label. And I like to use a little bit of fabric glue so that the label doesn't shift around while I'm sewing and end up not in the right place. This is Beacon Fabri-Tac. It's just in a different bottle. Put a little bit there so that stays folded, and a little bit on this one, so this one stays folded. Then I glue these together. I also eyeball how it's going to be in the mitten to make sure that the size will show when the tag is lifted up like that, because the size is only on one side of that little loop. Double check that before the glue dries. That's good. And then a little bit of glue on both of them. I like to put the label on the thumb side, which is now the down side of the mitten. That's right where I want it positioned. And then I'm going to clip it in place. And by the time I get to sewing that part, the glue will be dry so that the tag doesn't move around while I'm sewing it. Okay, we're going to be hand sewing the binding. You can use whatever thread you used to sew the mittens together, or just a home machine thread. It doesn't have to be a strong thread to sew the binding. And you'll want to use, ideally, something that matches your binding color. I'm going to use white so that you can see it. You want to go for about 3 times circumference of the mitten. And we're going to do the same knot we've done before. Make a loop, pass your thread under 1, 2, 3, 4 times. And my thread tail ended up a little long, so I'm going to trim that down. And for this, you can just use a regular hand sewing needle. You can use a Glover's needle if you want, but I find a regular hand sewing needle is easier. This thread does not have to be waxed. If you were using leather for the binding, it would be a good idea to go through and punch some holes in the leather on at least on one side before you do your sewing. That'll make it a lot easier to sew through, but you don't have to. So to hide our thread tail, we're going to pass the needle just through the lining, not through the binding, towards the top edge of that lining there, so that when the binding is folded over, our thread tail can be tucked up in there. And about there, I'm going to pass the needle through the binding from the inside to the outside. We want to make sure we have that binding folded over enough. And we're going to do a running stitch. So we're passing the needle from the inside to the outside, and we're just going through binding, lining, and binding. We're not going through the hide. That's what makes this binding easy to do, is you're not having to sew through the hide also. And then from this side, from the outside to the inside, inside to outside, outside to inside. And you can do a few stitches in a row before you pull your thread tight. You're going to do this all the way around. And if you use a matching thread, you won't really see it on your binding. It is possible to sew this binding on using a straight stitch on a regular sewing machine, but I find it very tricky because the bulk of the seam where the binding is sewn to the fur is thick and bulky, and so when your sewing machine foot is on it, it tends to want to ride to this edge, and so right along the edge here instead of sewing down here. So you're certainly welcome to try it with a sewing machine, but your mileage may vary. And as I'm sewing, I'm making sure I'm keeping this binding in place, pushing it back down with my thumb if it starts to creep upward. You can see how that gives you a nicely sewn finished edge. And so you would continue to sew all the way around, right along the edge of that tag on the binding, and around here. I'm not going to hand sew all of that because I don't want this mitten to be sewn with white thread. So I'm just going to finish it out for demonstration purposes. We'll pretend I already sewed all the way around. And I'll show you how to tie off and finish and hide your knot once you've completed the mitten. And again, the nice thing about sewing with just one strand of thread is that if you put a stitch in a place where you don't want it, say accidentally not paying attention, and I put a stitch where I don't want it, or I come around and accidentally do a whip stitch where the edge of the thread's going, or where the thread is going over the edge instead of back and forth. Just pull the thread out of the needle, and then I like to use the blunt end of the needle to get started on pulling that thread out. If I had doubled the thread on the needle and tied it on the end, you'd have to cut off the needle in order to take out your stitches and then try and tie it off and start over. And I'm doing pretty short stitches here. If you want it to go faster, you can do longer stitches. It's really up to you. So I made it back to our starting point, and I'm going to continue stitching for a few stitches at least, so that I have some stitches that overlap. So it'd be like back stitching, except you're not stitching backwards, but you're overlapping your stitches. But just like back stitching, it helps the ends where you tie off to be more secure. So again, I want to try and hide the knot when I tie off this thread so that it's not visible. So, and we've pretended that I've sewn all the way around back to the start, even though I didn't really on this pair of mittens. So I'm gonna push my needle through the binding, but not through the lining, so that my needle is coming out between the lining and the binding. And then, so you can see how the thread's coming out. And then I'm going to pass my needle under one of the previous threads from stitching around and make that little loop, pass the needle through that loop, and then pass the needle through this other loop that I just created. And that makes a nice and secure knot. You do have to, keeps getting in the way. You do have to pull it slow so that the knot ends up right down by the fabric and not like up here. And I'm going to do that one more time so that I know it'll be really secure. Passing the needle through that first loop and then through the second loop that I created. I'm going to pull that really slow, tighten it up. And then if you want, you can put a dot of glue or fray block on there. Okay. So now your knot is hidden, but if you cut your thread tail is going to show. So I'm going to take the needle right about where the knot is, have it go a little bit into the lining and then over to the side. And I've gone through the lining, but not through the other side of the binding. And I went about as long as I could, about as far away as I could. And then I'm going to pull that snug and trim that. And then the tail is in the lining under the binding there and not showing on either side. And it really gives a nice clean finish. I'm going to go ahead and sew these back up with black thread, and then you can see the finished result with black thread instead of white thread. So I sewed up the whole thing with a black thread. You can see those little stitches there. And the fur pretty well covers up the stitches on the outside. But if you pull it back, you'll probably have some little hairs caught in some of your threads. So you can take an awl or a seam ripper, something, and just kind of get under those hairs and pull them out from under the threads. You probably don't even need to do anyway because the hair lays over and covers it up. But it's a nice finishing touch anyway. You can see where the stitches fall on this side, maybe about a 1/4 inch or so away from this seam here. The next thing I'm going to show you is how to make a lanyard for your mittens. I'm When I make lanyards, I use this medium duty snap press to install the rivets. The place where I bought this one, they don't sell them anymore, unfortunately, so you'll have to see what you can find online. It is Cam brand, and you have to buy dies that match the different sizes of rivets or snaps if you want to use snaps. So you'll need a strap. 64 inches is a good length, somewhere around there if you can get it. 1 inch wide, 64 inches long. These are sold as purse straps, which is what you want because it's a nice, pliable, thin leather. It's not too heavy, but it's also not too stretchy. And the ones I get always come with this hole on the end. So I'm going to cut that off, but I want to use it for something. So to cut off the end, about 3.5 inches, I'm just going to mark that with my fingernail because it doesn't need to be super precise. And cut that off. This is going to be a little keeper for my straps, which you'll see at the end. So for that, I need a small hole because I'm going to use small rivets. I'm going to go with 2.5 for that. And this particular piece is optional to make. You don't have to have it. It's not going to really affect the function of your lanyard. And I also like to use some glue when I'm making these. It just makes it easier to keep everything together so it's not sliding around while you're trying to rivet it. And this is the same glue I used earlier, Beacon Fabri-Tac, just in a different bottle. You need to make sure that's overlapped enough that can punch a hole through the bottom layer and it won't cut off the end. I'm going to put a couple of clips there to let that dry while I work on the next step. Which is punching some holes at the other ends. I'm going to use 2.5 for that also. So these are both going to be folded over about 1.25 inches or so. Same thing on both ends of your strap. So one end is just going to have a snap. And you can use whatever kind of hardware you like. These ones, I think these are called trigger snaps. I like these, I like how they look, but you can use the regular like dog leash style or a bull snap, whatever you want. I'm going to use these medium 9mm rivets. Let me put post on one end and a cap on the other end. Post and a cap. And My 10mm dies. I don't have 9mm dies, so I use the 10. You can also get like a little hammer tool to set the rivets. Those are okay, but with rivets that are long, it tends to bend them and doesn't give you the cap and the post and flush with each other. They usually end up offset, which is okay if that's all you have. So that's one end. Okay, now we're gonna do the adjustable end. So you go up through one side, down the other side. So it looks like that, and you're gonna want some slack in it. And then through your hardware. Like that. It's not on the end for this one. And then you take your end and it goes over this bar. And then you'll put rivets in those holes. Same size, medium, with a 9mm post. Okay. Oh, and back to this little guy. Okay, so I glued it, and then now I need to punch the holes on the little inside piece. And then we're going to use little tiny small rivets, little 7mm small rivets for this. And I'm going to change out my dies to 8mm dies. And this is always a little tricky to rivet, but I can just finagle it in there and then it'll work. Okay, so now that's riveted, and you're gonna stretch it over. There you go. And that just keeps this loop of leather together, so it looks nice. That part's totally optional. Also, you don't have to make it adjustable. You could just do a strap and put clips on both ends like this if you know the length that you want your strap. But with this, we can make it really short if you want it really short, or full length if you want it full length. And if you don't want to buy rivets or invest in rivets, I'll show you an alternative way to secure the ends, and that can be done on either of these ends. It could be done on a strap like this. It would just be a little bit trickier since it's small. If you don't have a snap press or a rivet press, you don't need one. You can use leather lacing for the same thing. So you will need a hole just the right size that both pieces of your leather lace will fit through snugly. So the best way to do that is to start relatively small and then go bigger, because if you make it too big, then you're out of luck. So I'm going to try a 3.5 size hole. And we're doing 4 holes. Use these as a guide for the next holes. Okay, after you have your holes, you need to put your hardware on. And then take your leather strip, which you can just use a little piece of leather that you trimmed off of whatever you used for the palms of the mittens. And you're going to put both tails through the bottom holes, because those holes are doubled up. And you're going to leave a loop sticking up. And then you're going to put both tails through the top hole. And pull them to the front, but make sure you don't pull that loop all the way through. Then you're going to put the tails through that loop, and from the back, pull that loop tight and work the extra slack to the front and then down. That's going to be really secure, and it's going to be a way to make the lanyard without using rivets or a rivet press.